Global National with Dawna Friesen.
It has happened. This is Ukraine's capital. What seemed unthinkable in the 21st century is now underway. A democratic country has been invaded by its nuclear-armed neighbor on multiple fronts. People are not safe in their own homes. This apartment building in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, was struck, killing at least one person. Ukraine's president said tonight 137 people have died, 316 others are wounded. It is a full-scale attack, forcing Ukrainians to decide whether to flee or to fight. Ukraine's president has declared martial law, appealed for blood donations, and says weapons are being given to anyone who wants to defend the country. Russia, he says, is on a path of evil.
Україна захищається і не віддасть своєї свободи, щоб там не думали в Москві.
At the Kremlin, this chilling warning from the Russian president to countries coming to Ukraine's defense.
Что касается военной сферы, то современная Россия даже после развала СССР и утраты значительной части его потенциала является сегодня одной из самых мощных ядерных держав мира. И более того, обладает определенными преимуществами в ряде новейших видов вооружений.
Russia is using fighter jets, missiles, ground forces, and special forces, attacking from the east, the north, and the south, targeting both military infrastructure and major urban centers, including the capital city.
This is a deliberate, cold-blooded, and long-planned invasion. Despite its litany of lies, denials, and disinformation, the Kremlin's intentions are clear for the world to see.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
President Putin launched the greatest threat to European stability since World War II.
History will judge President Putin as harshly as the world condemns him today. Today, he cements his place in the ranks of the reviled European dictators.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Many Ukrainians are staying to fight. Others are fleeing in an attempt to keep their families safe. We have special coverage tonight, beginning with Goomansingh at the Polish border. Crystal.
Dawna, this is the Kharkova border crossing between Ukraine and Poland. Throughout the day, we've seen a steady stream of cars crossing over. And we've also seen a large contingent of the Polish army sort of organizing things here along with border guards. Now, as Russia's invasion intensifies, this is one of the border crossings where we anticipate to see a large number of Ukrainians crossing over to flee that fighting. From Kharkiv to Chuhuyev to Kiev, civilian-occupied zones were not spared by Russian missiles, the widespread invasion commencing in the early morning hours Thursday. Among key strategic sites targeted, Kiev's airport reportedly now under the control of Russian forces. Bombings, too, at the other airports and military sites. And Ukraine's prime minister confirms Russia now controls the Chernobyl nuclear plant. Russian troops unrelenting in their attacks. Vladimir Putin saying Ukraine needed to be demilitarized. I urge all Ukrainian soldiers to immediately lay down your arms and go home. But many Ukrainians are unwilling to take orders from the Kremlin. I will take my children away and return. We will fight this off. Ukraine will win no matter what, said one man departing Kiev following the bombings. Those willing to stand and fight are being given the full support of Ukraine's president. We are already handing out weapons, and we hand them out to defend our country to everyone who wants and has the capability to defend our sovereignty. The future of Ukraine depends on every citizen. As Ukrainians battled Russian fighters by air and land, Volodymyr Zelenskyy urged his people to stay calm, telling them the military, a fraction of the size of Russia's, would be victorious if they stayed united. Let's not panic. Let's do everything that is needed to support armed forces of Ukraine. Together, we must save Ukraine, save democratic world. Lithuania and Moldova have declared states of emergency, anticipating further aggression beyond Ukraine's borders. Putin already warned other nations to stay on the sidelines or face, quote, consequences that you have never encountered in your history. And even now, on the other side of that border, there are multiple battles being fought at different sites. Dawna?
Crystal Goomansingh in Poland tonight, thank you. Well, Ukraine has been pleading for the world to help and for swift and hard sanctions against Russian interests to cut it off from the world. Now that the attack has begun, that is beginning to happen. But is it enough to stop Vladimir Putin, who has laughed in the face of past sanctions? We'll have Canada's response in just a moment, but we begin with Jackson Proskow in Washington.
The global response to Russia has been swift and sharp.
And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that.
The U.S. led the charge with American sanctions cutting off Russian banks from the global financial system, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets and barring high-tech exports to Russian companies.
The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened.
We'll be imposing.
The moves were backed by similar announcements in London and across Europe.
These powers will enable us totally to exclude Russian banks from the UK financial system, which is, of course, by far the largest in Europe.
All told, countries representing half the global economy are taking action against Vladimir Putin. Russia won't be able to do business in dollars, pounds, euros, or yen, according to officials. Russian oligarchs, the elite who support Putin, are being squeezed directly too.
We don't need sanctions that bark. We need sanctions that bite. And if the sanctions bite, they need to bite in a very thorough way.
Yet there is division amongst Western allies over how far to go. Russia's energy sector has emerged unscathed. Higher oil prices would benefit the Kremlin and damage Western economies.
Sanctions we oppose exceed anything that's ever been done.
There's also a deep line in the sand. The U.S. and NATO insist they will not intervene militarily in Ukraine, though the U.S. is sending another 7,000 troops to bolster NATO allies in the region. And cyber attacks against key Russian infrastructure remain an option, but the U.S. says only if Russia attacks Western interests first. The sanctions announced today have two purposes. One is an immediate blow to Russia. The second is a longer-term set of consequences. And one thing that's still very much on the table tonight are personal sanctions against Vladimir Putin. Those could be announced in the coming days. Dawna?
All right, Jackson, thank you. Canada imposed more sanctions today targeting members of the Russian elite and major banks. With me from Ottawa is Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Mélanie Joly. Madam Minister, let me ask you about those sanctions. You know, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister has made it very clear what he thinks needs to happen. He tweeted today, "I will not be diplomatic on this. Everyone who now doubts whether Russia should be banned from SWIFT, which is the international banking system, has to understand that the blood of innocent Ukrainian men, women and children will be on their hands too. Ban Russia from SWIFT." He is unequivocal. Why is that not happening right now?
Well, you know, we've said that there would be extremely strong sanctions. That's what we announced today. And we're doing so at the same time as all our G7 allies, so the US, the UK, the EU, and Japan. But we've also said, and I've also said, Dawna, that we would be adding sanctions. We had already restricted, actually limited completely, the sovereign debt of Russia, so the capacity of Russia to finance itself in within our economy. And we had already said that we would be making a dealings ban between Canada and the two regions at the beginning of the week that had been recognized as independent, which is Donetsk and Luhansk by the Putin, and this recognition is completely outraging. What we're doing today is even more. All the major banks of Russia are now under sanction. We're making sure also that more than 60 individuals and entities are sanctioned by Canada.
I understand the sanctions announced today are more severe than they've ever been, but why hold back others? Why not sanction Putin himself? Why not ban Russia from SWIFT?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I mentioned, we will continue to impose sanctions. We will make sure that we're acting in a coordinated way. We very much know also that Canada doesn't have a huge amount of trade with Russia because of our geography, but because also we had sanctioned years ago when Russia invaded Crimea, 400 individuals and entities. What we want to do, though, is to make sure that there's no loophole in this sanction approach.
Can you see a point where Canadian soldiers would be on the ground in Eastern Europe fighting Russian forces?
Well, we've decided to reinforce our participation within NATO, and should Article 5, so should a threat to use of force against a member of the alliance be done by Russia, well, of course, we will make sure to react and promptly. That's why I had the chance to be in contact with Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, earlier today, because obviously what is at stake right now is Europe's security. And when Europe's security is at stake, it is also our own security that is at stake.
Minister Joly, thanks for taking time with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawna. Thank you to all.
Mercedes Stephenson is with me now from Ottawa. Mercedes, Canada and other countries holding back, being as tough as they could be with sanctions. Are they keeping their powder dry? What are we and our allies waiting for?
I think a lot of people are wondering that as we see what looks like a full-scale invasion in Ukraine. People are wondering why not act now. There's a few reasons that may be going into this calculation. The first is political will of our allies. Essentially, the G7 NATO countries want to act in lockstep because it's more powerful. But some of those countries could face significant economic consequences for action taken, including Canada. There's also the desire right now to leave an exit route for Vladimir Putin to perhaps fall back and not try to hold all of Ukraine, and concerns that targeting him in particular could lead to a bit of a Trumpian response, where if he's challenged, he becomes more aggressive personally. But I did ask Prime Minister Justin Trudeau if sanctioning Vladimir Putin is on his radar. This is what he said today.
The key thing on sanctions has been to come forward in a coordinated way with all our allies, and that is the unity that is most damaging to the Kremlin and to Vladimir Putin, that we are all unequivocal and united on this.
So it sounds like it's potentially on the table. There are more sanctions coming, but they need the buy-in, obviously, of all the allies in order to do that. In the meantime, there are other things that can be done as well, including banning Russian oil and gas from Canada. It is imported here. The Prime Minister would not commit to that today. And of course, the Ukrainians are asking for things. They are asking for things including weapons and support. Take a listen to what the Ukrainian Chargé d'Affaires told me.
They need helmets. They need tactical armored jackets. They need firearms. They are ready to fight, but they need ammunition. They need equipment, and then they need arms. Yes, indeed, we need more.
So, Dawna, whether or not Canada decides to provide more lethal aid remains to be seen.
Okay, Mercedes, thanks. Neil Hauer is a Canadian journalist in Kiev tonight. Neil, thanks for speaking with us. You know, people have known for weeks that this might happen, that Russia might invade. Now that it's happened, what is it like there?
I mean, it's very surreal. There's no sign of them yet in the center of the city here. I mean, we're still very early days. Russia, the vast majority of Russian forces are not committed yet. We heard jets over the capital about a couple hours ago, and especially west of the capital, at an airfield there, Russia launched a wave of paratroopers through. They sent about 50 attack helicopters and landed paratroopers at that airfield, and they're now trying to establish that as a forward base to establish an air bridge to bring reinforcements directly to the doorstep of Kiev.
Neil, it sounds quiet where you are right now. What do people fear most?
I mean, I think people fear that, you know, Russia will go all the way with this, and that everything is on the table. I mean, the people fear, you know, that they might just start bombing severely Kiev. They might start bombing the city itself.
Neil Hauer in Kiev tonight. Thanks. What is the point and the power of economic sanctions? That's coming up. The weapon being used against Russia right now is sanctions. The idea is to hit the Russian economy and Putin's inner circle, cutting off their money. Jeff Semple looks at the power of sanctions and whether they'll make any difference to Vladimir Putin.
As Russian forces invaded Ukraine, Western countries responded with a different kind of weapon.
We're living in a world where the tools of war are actually economic and trade weapons.
Canada, the US, and Europe announcing a slew of sanctions.
Measures that are tougher than anything we've ever seen before as far as Russia is concerned.
But this hedge fund manager and high-profile Kremlin critic says the measures still fall short.
What is fundamentally upsetting to Vladimir Putin is going after his own money. And what all of the sanctions programs so far are missing is going after his own money.
Putin's own money, he says, is controlled by around 50 Russian oligarchs whose assets were left untouched. And even the sanctions targeting Russia's economy are less potent now than they were after its annexation of Crimea in 2014. In the 7 years since, Putin has only furthered Russia's foreign reserves and resilience.
So it's less dependent on the US dollar. It's less dependent on oil revenues because the other thing that it's done is actually pivot to the east.
From crude oil to computer chips, Russia now does more business with China and Eurasian nations. It's also creating its own international payment system in case it gets cut off from SWIFT. Germany and Italy in particular are reportedly resisting kicking Russia out of the international banking system, that seen as a nuclear option, carrying significant economic consequences, especially for nations that rely on Russian oil.
Europe sucks on Russian gas like a crackhead on a pipe. And how does a junkie sanction its dealer? It's very, very difficult.
Western leaders insist the SWIFT option is still on the table, but the latest sanctions come too late for the people of Ukraine. Jeff Semple, Global News.
Ahead, Vladimir Putin's grand plan to restore Russia's glory. After taking office in 2000, the Russian president called the collapse of the Soviet Union a genuine tragedy and the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Is this invasion of Ukraine one step in his plan to reconstitute the Soviet Union? Eric Sorensen looks at Putin's grand plan.
Few saw it coming to this: Russia launching a war on its democratic neighbor. Vladimir Putin told Russian business leaders he had no option. They've created such security risks we could not react differently, he said. Vladimir Putin, a one-time KGB operative, has long feared the West's threat to Russia's security. For 20 years, he has rebuilt or forced compliant relationships on Russia's borders. But Ukraine would not comply. In 2014, mass protests and unrest ousted the Kremlin-friendly Ukrainian leader. Putin and Russia almost immediately took over Crimea and backed rebel unrest elsewhere. But the risk remained of Ukraine slipping from Russia's historic influence and control.
In that reassertion of the Russian sphere of influence, Ukraine is the grand prize. Everybody else is like small potatoes.
Ukraine is strategically crucial to Russia's own sense of security. It fears a potential gateway for NATO into the Russian heartland.
If Ukraine becomes a NATO member, is that Russia's military capabilities, capacity, and its own security would be at risk.
But if Russia's military campaign is successful, it could destabilize the West.
The target is the stability in Europe and the whole of the international peace order.
Putin has appealed to Russian patriotism for support. But even at home, there are Russians who oppose the invasion, risking arrest for speaking out. The usually pragmatic Russian leader has now played his cards, revealing just how large are his fears and his ambitions. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Next, the worldwide signs of solidarity with Ukraine. A full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is not something the world can turn a blind eye to. Mike Armstrong looks at how people around the globe are rallying in solidarity with Ukraine.
It is a simple gesture, small and probably not even noticed by most passing by. But City Hall in Canada's capital on this day is flying the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine. There have been protests for weeks. What's going on now is different. It's no longer about pressuring Vladimir Putin and trying to prevent military action. That's happening. Rallies like this one in Greece are now about solidarity. There is disappointment, sadness, anger, fear, this woman says, and worry. Ukrainians everywhere share that last one, the worry. Being far from home and watching from afar is painful.
We need help. We need someone to support us.
It's our land. We didn't do anything wrong. It's just Putin's ambitions.
Hands off Ukraine!
If the emotions are there, and they are, it's all just starting. Explosions and the exodus are only the beginning. Whether it's people huddled in bomb shelters or fleeing the country, these stories of sadness are just the first of many.
Oh, just shattered, not for myself, I don't care about my own safety, I care about Ukraine.
Now, just because a conflict starts one way, in one place, doesn't mean it ends there. Europeans know war has a way of ignoring borders, even if that's what's being fought over. When war starts, this man says, you don't know where it's going to go. This chant in Moscow is no to war. There are videos of Russians protesting their country's actions. Those videos also show many being arrested. Russian authorities realizing perhaps that if conflicts sometimes snowball into something bigger, resistance sometimes does that as well.
This is not the Russian people's war, this is the Kremlin's war. And this is St. Petersburg. Thousands of protesters took to the streets in a number of Russian cities today, saying no to war and paying a price for it. Protest is illegal in Russia. Human rights groups say more than 1,700 people have been arrested. That is Global National for this Thursday. Thanks for watching.